Hello and welcome to World Panorama, your weekly roundup of the top international stories. I'm Tracy Shilshi and here are the headlines. US President Donald Trump's controversial travel ban comes into effect. People from 6 mainly Muslim countries and all refugees now face tougher entry into America. Prime Minister Narendra Modi holds talks with US President Donald Trump in Washington, D.C. One-on-one and delegation-level meetings focus on a wide range of bilateral issues. Terrorism tops the agenda. After concluding his 2-day trip to the US, Prime Minister Modi visits the Netherlands. 3 MOUs on water management, cultural cooperation and amending social security arrangements are signed. And the India-China standoff at Sikkim border continues. Beijing uses its state-run media to call India unruly, claims China usually avoids making an issue of border disputes, but New Delhi rejects the accusations. First to the US, where after months of bitter legal squabbling, the Trump administration's modified travel ban took effect this week. The new guidelines are designed to avert the chaos of the original rollout, but the rules are likely to new round of court fights. Under the ban, citizens of the 6 targeted countries will be denied visas unless they can prove a close family relationship or a connection with a school or business in the US. Here are more details.
This is the protection of the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. We all know what that means. Protection of the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. That's big stuff.
After months of winding through the courts, US President Donald Trump's travel ban comes into effect. This after the country's Supreme Court on Monday partially restored the ban. For entry into the United States, applicants now must prove a bona fide relationship with a US person or entity. If a close relationship is not established, one is banned for 90 days if from Libya, Syria, Iran, Somalia, Yemen and Sudan, and 120 days if one is a refugee from any country.
The creation of the terminology of the bona fide relationship has really only spread more across the board to provide uncertainty for people who are the most vulnerable across the world. And right now, the world is watching us. The world is watching the United States of America. And what they are saying is, we thought that that was the country for opportunity and justice for all, but it does not seem that way.
However, the officials say that visas that have already been approved will not be revoked. Authorities have assured that the implementation would be smooth, unlike the turmoil that greeted the original travel ban. US customs officers, lawyers and immigration officials will be at the country's airports to observe the ban's implementation. However, groups like Amnesty International have dispatched monitors to airports to observe whether anyone was being denied entry. Rights group also suggests that more legal battles are to come.
A ban like this really hurts the family structure, especially when the State Department or the government or the Trump administration is now trying to define exactly what a family is. And, I don't really think that the government is really in a position or should be in a position to do so. As you all know, we're the plaintiffs in the IRAP v. Trump case, and come October, we are confident that we will prevail, that we will be able to give that voice to those in need.
On the campaign trail, then-candidate Donald Trump called for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. The original travel ban in January was imposed with no notice in an executive order, putting travelers in limbo. It was later put on hold by the country's lower courts. On Monday, the country's top court restored the ban partially, but will hear further arguments in the case in October. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
All right, for more on this story, we've got Pramit Pal Chaudhary, is the foreign editor with the Hindustan Times, joining us in studio. Pramit, thanks so much for being here. The ban, of course, goes partially into effect, isn't it? Because there are some courts still weighing in on, how it actually plays out constitutionally.
Yes, I think the state of Hawaii has now gone back into that battle. But the Supreme Court having, well, I wouldn't say, as you said, argued that it could be partially allowed in. The government, obviously, the Trump administration will now go ahead with whatever they can possibly do. Ultimately, the game for Trump is that he needs this for his political constituency. The working class voted him into power, very anti-Islamic and are very concerned about the terrorism issue.
Yes.
And they're anti-immigrant. So to merge all of those together into one policy is very useful for him. To some degree, I'm not even too sure he cares whether it succeeds in actually banning anybody from coming into the country, but it must look like it's working.
Yes.
And in fact, when the original ban was announced, Steve Bannon, his chief strategist, who was at the heart of a lot of this attempts to woo this working class vote, had said, let's announce this on a Friday so that protests can happen on Saturday and Sunday when people are not working, and then we'll get a lot more television people yelling and shouting, denouncing Trump for doing so. Then his constituents will be happy. They'll be like, oh, he's actually doing something, because the people we don't like are supporting it. So I think so he will continue to persist with this policy regardless of whether it actually makes any sense or whether it works, because he's getting a lot of traction with his on this issue.
Absolutely. So as far as that divide goes of us versus them, irrespective of whether this successfully goes through or not, the travel ban, and whether it actually goes on to perhaps include other Muslim countries as well, there is already this debate which is now raging across the US, and that a lot of strategists, of course, calling it dangerous. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I think Trump's policy has been deliberate polarization. I mean, he has, as you said, an us and them policy, that there's as he says, an elite, liberal elite living in the big metropolitan cities, which he himself comes from, versus a white working class rural population, small town rural population, which voted him into office. And so he deliberately makes sure that some of his policies are designed to set these two groups against each other.
Yes.
And that shores up his support. And his support, his poll rating is now down to about 30%, which essentially means he's now back to only his core vote group and nobody else. So he needs to keep pushing policies like this every now and then, which are designed to keep that core constituency believing that he is doing something on their behalf. And even if he's not doing something on their behalf, the game is to ensure that if the other 60% are protesting against him, then something must be going well for that constituency.
But what about those who are hanging in the balance now as far as visas are concerned, as far as traveling to the US is concerned? Because even as, as far as bona fide family members are concerned, is still pretty vague as to who all apply to that, and also for refugees. I mean, what happens to to their status? I mean, because they have to obviously reach an international organization, a refugee organization, but in order to do that, I mean, there's no bona fide member there in the US.
And that clarity will have to come out from, I think we're going to have a number of more lawsuits, basically. And the Supreme Court will effectively have to decide one by one on each of these cases. And say, but I suspect that we will see. Now remember, that I don't expect it to actually, the number of countries to expand, because the number of countries that were chosen were based on a watch list that was created under the Obama administration. And they chose only those countries that are on that list. They've already thrown Iraq off that list because Iraq, they're actually busy, Iraq is their ally in the war against the Islamic State. Iran, anyway, because U.S.-Iranian relations are so fraught, there's always been a bit of a problem on the visas. And some countries like Somalia, which are essentially in civil war or actually controlled by the IS or some affiliates, they don't allow, or Libya, for example, they don't allow any immigrants anyway. So you're really down to just a handful of countries being involved. And as you said, refugees, but keep in mind that these countries, Syria is the only one that generates a lot of refugees. And even under Obama, they said we will only take in about 5,000 refugees. But the screening process required by the Americans, because of their fear that any of these might be suspect Islamic State fighters, is so stringent that hardly any refugees have actually gotten through. So in many ways, it's all about the symbolism rather than actually what is happening on the ground. But refugees or immigrants from other countries, including Muslim-majority countries like, let's say, Egypt or Saudi Arabia, who are migrating on a normal basis, are getting through without any problems. There's no real issues on that front.
All right, so he is attracting attention where he really requires it, which is, of course, the basic American families. And perhaps that in itself is something at least positive on his front. But thanks so much, Pramit, for joining us for these details. We'll keep an eye, of course, on all those lawsuits like you talked about and what eventually comes out of details on that. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Donald Trump struck a common note on terrorism as they met for the first time at the White House on Monday. The two leaders vowed to fight against terrorism, saying that it was their topmost priority. Both countries also pledged to deepen defense and security cooperation. Here are more details.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi met US President Donald Trump at the White House on Monday in the first face-to-face meeting between the two leaders. Prime Minister expressed gratitude for the warm welcome extended to him and said he was deeply touched with the grand welcome he and his delegation received during this trip.
The way I and my delegation have been welcomed, respected. This is a respect for 1.25 billion people of India. For this, I express gratitude to the President and the First Lady.
It's a great honor to have Prime Minister Modi of India, who has been such a great Prime Minister. I've been speaking with him and reading about you, and you have done a great job.
The two leaders held delegation-level talks and affirmed their commitment to bolster the US-India strategic partnership. Both the countries struck a common note on terrorism and agreed to enhance cooperation in fighting the menace of terrorism, extremism and radicalization. The two leaders also sent out a strong message to Pakistan, asking it to ensure that its territory was not used to launch cross-border terror strikes.
We have agreed to enhance our cooperation in fighting against these scourges, fighting terrorism and doing away with the safe shelters. Their sanctuaries and safe havens will be an important part of our cooperation.
Briefing the media after talks, US President Donald Trump said the relationship between the two countries had never been stronger and better. Trump also said he was keen to work with Modi on creating a fair and reciprocal trading relationship between the two nations. He also called for a removal of barriers for the exports of US goods into Indian markets.
The relationship between India and the United States has never been stronger, has never been better. I'm proud to announce to the American people and to the Indian people that Prime Minister Modi and I are world leaders in social media. We're believers, giving the citizens of our countries the opportunity to hear directly from their elected officials and for us to hear directly from them. I guess it's worked very well in both cases.
Earlier in the day, the Prime Minister also met US Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis and US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. Prime Minister held an extensive discussion on counter-terrorism with Mattis during their meeting. They also discussed the situation in Afghanistan.
There was discussion on counter-terrorism, cooperation in counter-terrorism again. In fact, first because Secretary Mattis's meeting was the first. And there was discussion also on the situation in Afghanistan, and the conversation briefly touched upon how the situation can evolve and what the two countries can do together.
Later in the day, President Trump hosted a dinner in honor of Prime Minister Modi. Modi, who was visiting US for the 5th time in 3 years, extended a warm invitation to President Trump and his family to visit India. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
With a quick break here, we'll be back with more news in a bit. Stay with us.
This is Kibutu in Arunachal Pradesh, East Point East on the map of India. Kibutu is dangerously close to the Chinese pressure point. We see first-hand and unseen areas of sand dunes and see how BSF is guarding this difficult territory along the Indo-Pak borderline. We are now slowly entering into the interior-most parts of the Sir Creek area. Indo-Tibetan Border Police Force justifies each word of this saying. Watch super exclusive episodes of National Security series only on Rajya Sabha television.
Welcome back. Now, India and Netherlands on Tuesday signed 3 MOUs on water management, cultural cooperation and amending social security arrangement. The MOUs were signed in the presence of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Dutch counterpart Mark Rutte in Amsterdam. Both leaders also reaffirmed their countries' commitment towards the Paris climate deal.
On the final leg of his 3-nation tour, Prime Minister Narendra Modi held talks with his Dutch counterpart Mark Rutte at Kutschers in The Hague. Both leaders deliberated on a series of bilateral and international issues. Hailing India's economic reforms, Dutch Prime Minister Rutte called India a global economic power.
When it comes to the economy, India's onward development is opening new doors to trade and investments in both our countries. India is now a global economic power. It's the world's 12th biggest economy and has a population of more than 1.2 billion. So the Indian market has a lot of potential.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi lauded the Netherlands for helping India successfully get a membership of the Missile Technology Control Regime. He also called the Netherlands a natural partner in India's road to development.
भारत और नीदरलैंड के संबंध सदियों पुराने हैं.
The relationship between India and Netherlands is very old and the ties have been growing stronger every year.
आगे बढ़ते रहे हैं. द्विपक्षीय investments.
In terms of investment, Netherlands is the 5th largest source of foreign direct investment to India. In fact, in last 3 years, it has been the 3rd largest source of FDI.
Source of foreign direct investment है. In fact, पिछले 3 वर्षों में Netherlands हमारा 3rd largest source of foreign direct investment बनकर के उभरा है.
The Netherlands is India's 6th largest trading partner in the European Union and a major investor in Indian sectors of technology, energy, logistics, financial services and transport. Trade between the two countries has continued to grow steadily and stood at $9 billion in 2014-2015 with positive balance of trade in India's favour. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Army Chief General Bipin Rawat visited Sikkim in the backdrop of a standoff between Indian troops and Chinese army along the Sino-Indian border. He took stock of the operational matters and interacted with top commanders in the formation headquarters of the force in the border state. The visit came amid mounting tension between the two armies along the border in Sikkim following a scuffle between Indian troops and the personnel of China's People's Liberation Army in a remote area earlier this month.
The border standoff continues between India and China, even as Beijing used its state-run media to call India unruly and said it needs to be taught the rules. An opinion piece published by Chinese daily Global Times claimed that China usually avoids making an issue of border disputes. The article also said India can't afford a showdown with China on border issues. Besides calling India arrogant, the tabloid said India's GDP was only a quarter of China's. But it asserted that China had no desire to confront India. In another development, China justified road construction in Sikkim, claiming that the area was undoubtedly located on its side of the border under the 1890 Sino-British Treaty. On Tuesday, China lodged a diplomatic protest with India, accusing Indian troops of crossing the boundary in the Sikkim region and demanded their immediate withdrawal.
China has already expressed the seriousness of its stance. I want to emphasize that China is sincere about developing Sino-Indian relations, but at the same time, China's stance of protecting its own sovereignty is also unmovable.
The Chinese statement comes a day after the Chinese military accused Indian troops of objecting to a road construction in what it claimed to be Chinese territory. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif meanwhile visited the victims of a massive blaze that took place on Monday morning. The Pakistani government also announced 2 million each for the deceased and 1 million each for the injured as compensation. Around 200 people were charred to death and 117 others injured when an oil tanker overturned. As crowds rushed to collect the fuel that spilled over on the highway, the tanker fire apparently sparked by a passerby lighting a cigarette.
Hundreds killed and scores injured in oil tanker inferno in Pakistan's Bahawalpur city on Sunday. Reports say the tanker filled with oil overturned and spilled while trying to navigate a turn. A huge crowd gathered to collect the oil from the spillage. Traffic police tried in vain to keep the crowds away from the tanker as local people, including women and children, continued collecting fuel. A huge fire then erupted, engulfing all the people standing around the vehicle.
I lived just on the other side of the road. I came here after I went to church. Suddenly, I heard loud explosion sounds, seeing the oil tanker burning out. All the motorbikes and people were on fire. Bodies can be seen everywhere, around over 100. The oil tanker was capsized and the oil spilled out from it. Many people shouted, "Oil, oil, oil." Some took buckets and other containers to collect the oil. The local traffic police arrived at site and asked people to go away from the site and warned it may explode. But they didn't follow the words. Suddenly, the fire broke out and over 100 people were on fire.
Several vehicles were damaged in the fire, including 6 cars and 12 motorcycles. Fire and rescue teams immediately reached the accident site and doused the flames. Bodies of many were charred beyond recognition. Army helicopters were dispatched to ferry casualties to hospitals. The nearby Ahmedpur Sharkia Health Centre and Bahawal Victoria Hospital have no burn units. As a result, some casualties were taken to distant hospitals. The death toll is expected to rise as many of the injured are reported to be in a critical condition.
Pakistan aviation helicopters have arrived. All those who are critically injured are being shifted from Bahawalpur to Multan and Kharia Burn Center.
The tanker had been transporting 25,000 litres of fuel from Karachi to Lahore. Traffic on the national highway route has been suspended. Pakistan Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is cutting short a visit to London in response to the incident. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And that's how we could pack in on World Panorama this week. Thanks so much for joining us.